Hello and welcome to another episode of Intentionally Act Live. This is your host, Enrico E. Manalo, here with my very special guest, Dr. Julia Jordan-Zachery. Dr. Julia Jordan-Zachery, once again, is the Africana Studies Department Chair at UNC Charlotte. Julia will be joining the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department at Wake Forest University on July 1st as the new incoming chair and professor of WGSS. Recently, Julia proposed that Black women all over the world come together and mourn on Friday, April 30th, 2021. Before we get into that, how are you today, Julia?
I am well. I am well. Thank you for hosting me. And how are you?
I'm doing very well. I was doing not so well yesterday, as you know, because I was kind of experiencing the side effects of the COVID vaccine that I got. But I'm feeling so much better today, and just really, really glad to be here with you. So, by way of kind of introducing yourself to our audience a little bit, I wonder if you could, kind of dive into our kind of boilerplate.
Why did I fall in love with what I do? Um, I I don't know that I had a choice, you know?
What does that mean?
Well, what that means is I think that I am actually doing what I was sent on earth to do,
Okay.
which is to pose questions, look for answers, to think about freedom. And what freedom means, particularly for me coming from a former colonial country, Barbados, even before I had a particular language that I eventually learned in the academy, I always had questions around freedom and what it meant for Black folk, previously oppressed folk. And so I think I make fun and I tell this story. I was about 8, 9 years old, sitting on our back patio having a conversation and heated conversation with my father about the role of the IMF. And so I think that what I do found, was given to me, because I've come to kind of accept that what I do has very little to do with Julia. Um, and it's simply a reflection of me trying to listen to what was given to me, the questions that I probably came to life with. And I am fortunate that I've been able to follow those questions as part of a career.
That's actually a really fascinating way to answer that question. And some of what's resonating about that for me is recently somebody asked me, let's see if I can get this right. Somebody asked me like something along the lines of, what is it that made you want to help in general? And that kind of got me thinking, right? I wouldn't say that. Well, if I'm being really honest, I think that I've spent a lot of my life kind of resisting that, and kind of trying to conform to that very American expectation of, oh, find what you love to do and find what satisfies your soul. These kind of very individualistic things. And everything in my life kind of bent toward this idea of, it's not just about me. And for me to create space for myself, I also had to create space for other people, because we're all so very deeply interconnected. So to make it only about me is not only like, wildly selfish, but just frankly unreasonable.
Mhm. And it can be, I remember as a little girl, I would have, chalk and my dolls laid out teaching while everybody else was outside playing. And, and I haven't really strayed from that. And I am really grateful that I've been able to do that, because I think society sometimes, as you kind of said, it pulls us away from some of the things that we were probably sent here to do. Now, I don't know that we're sent here to do one thing for an entire lifetime.
Hmm.
I think maybe we were sent here to possibly do one thing, maybe in different forms or different things. Um, but for me, I truly honor that I am able to to teach, right? And so, and not to get particularly biblical, but it is part of my ministry, and not from a religious standpoint by any stretch of the imagination, right? And so to be able to access that and stumble into that, because I make fun and I said, I had no intention of being a professor. That little 8-year-old little girl who wanted to be an economist and go home back to Barbados and run the central bank. Oh, right. That was my intention. I'm going to run the central bank of Barbados.
Hey, there's still time, right?
Well, a couple things. I'm a woman, and I've learned in life that means something in terms of access to certain kind of spaces. But I also realized that while I'm really passionate about equity and justice, and that's what got me to where I am today, that kind of curiosity around economic justice and the role of the IMF in coming into countries and determining what their economy looks like, etc. That was simply the catalyst that got me here.
Okay.
But I don't think I was supposed to do that.
Oh, okay.
Right? Because in pursuing or thinking about being an economist is how I actually stumbled into the academy.
Oh,
Right? Wasn't my intention. I was like, a professor? Like, I don't know what that is.
well, it's so interesting that you say that because, as I mentioned to you privately, my father is an economics professor. And to be quite honest, though, I deal with a lot of things that are related to economics and, income inequality and things like that. I would be lying if I said I fully understood what it is that my father does. It all seems very esoteric, very magical to me. He constructs these formulas, and then he's able to predict the future based on buying habits of horse owners and things like that. I still have no idea how that works, but it is fascinating. I am very curious, though, because in addition to teaching, you are also a writer, and you've written a number of books, including Black Women, Cultural Images, and Social Policy, which I understand has won some awards, and Shadow Bodies, Black Women, Ideology, Representation, and Politics, among others. So it seems like there's this real fascination, not only with writing, because that is an immense challenge unto itself. It's not something that somebody like casually takes up. Is very, very painstaking, I can say from personal experience. But what is it particularly about Black women that kind of stimulates that writing side in you?
Mhm. I mean, other than the fact that I am a Black woman,
Mhm.
you know, and I think that probably had something to do with it. But again, I go back to my childhood. So my mother was a mental health nurse,
Oh,
and she was instrumental. It was her and one other person in Barbados starting the community mental health program. And when we had vacation time, and I was actually in Barbados because I would come back and forth, I would go around parts of the island with my mother. And her argument in part was that we ought to take medicine and services to the community as opposed to expecting community members to always come to where services are
yeah.
available, right? We ought to go where they live. We ought to care for them where they live. And and I wrote this in Shadow Bodies that she would often say that women and children were the most vulnerable in society.
Yeah.
And where I would see, I mean, she was always very passionate about those that were mentally ill and serving them with dignity and recognizing their
Wow.
humanity, right? But one of the things that, when I would see her get most passionate, it would be around the ill treatment of women and children. and I mean, she would get really passionate coming up against a line where she could possibly have lost her job and the whole nine,
Wow.
right? She was not shy about defending, and I wish like I had this picture, and then I'll come back in a little bit. But I remember I can't remember exactly how old I was, but there was the nurses, one nursing union was on strike, and it wasn't the union my mother belonged to.
Oh.
So my mother went in solidarity, and she also went on strike in solidarity with this union. And and I still laugh about this because who showed up on the cover of the newspaper? My mother. And where was she protesting? Outside of the office where my father worked.
Oh.
I was like, well, this ought to be interesting. you know? And I really wish, that I had that picture because I would love to use that on a book cover.
Yeah.
Okay. But I tell that story, because my mother taught me a lot about advocacy. And again, I didn't have that language of like Black feminism or anything like that. I didn't have the language of advocacy, but I had a practice, right? A real practice of what it means to care. And later in life, I started calling myself, a Black feminist as I was introduced to that language. And then it dawned on me, like I've always had this as a model, and the best way to kind of model these things is to actually do it. And so again, I don't know that I intentionally sought to talk about Black women, but I think, and I've gotten to the point where I no longer say I do research. I say I tell stories. And I
Mm.
tell the stories that are given to me. And the stories right now that are given to me are about Black women.
Mm.
And I feel compelled, right? Like I have to tell these stories. And I've had moments like you of resisting. So like this project that I'm working on, this edited volume, these two edited volumes on Black women in COVID, I did not want that project at all. And I can still remember last year, I stayed in my garden and I pulled every weed and I would not come inside. And it was like, well, you gonna listen today, little girl. And the ancestors were like, you are going to listen. I was like, no, I'm not. I don't have to listen to you all. You're right. I came in the house, I washed my hand, and I cannot tell you what happened between me washing my hands and the call for papers.
Mm.
Never written anything like that in my life.
No.
Nope. It was like a first draft. And, this is what I tell people, that these are things that are given to me. And my job, my only job, I think, is to have integrity in what I'm given to do. Right? Yeah. Mhm.
So it's like I know from my own experience in writing, sometimes there's those things that you write that you really have to wrestle out of the ether before it's even a first draft, and that first draft is terrible and it takes like a lot of polishing. And then there's those other times where it literally just it couldn't have come from you, like it flows through you. And so when I hear you say this and talk about integrity, that's like something that I'd never really thought about before, is that integrity piece. And yeah, I mean, that resonates very deeply, because if we are the conduits for certain things, then we might not be able to control where it's flowing from, but we can do our best not to obstruct that flow, or to make sure that it's shaped in a way that will be better received. And so that's just a really lovely image that I never thought of. So thank you for that.
You're Again, I'm not sure that that's Julia, but I think that the challenge is, for me, the challenge is to listen and discern. So
Mm.
is it Julia or is it something else? And if I'm resisting, why am I resisting? How could I be open? Again, I have this other project that I'm working on. It's called Wild Women, Black Women Living the Erotic. And when I moved to North Carolina, I got into this practice before COVID of exploring once a month, exploring a different part of North Carolina. Cause I'm like, I don't want to just, live in four corners. And I'd gone out to this spot, and I was intentional. I was like, I'm not taking writing, anything to write on. I'm not taking a computer. Now, anybody who knows me knows from the time I was a little girl, you always found me with a pencil and a piece of paper, right? So me being intentional about not taking anything to write on, well, I had a pen. But I didn't have a notebook. I didn't have anything. And this project just, came, and I literally was like, started Googling, like, where's the closest store I could get a notebook? Right? Because I'm still old school. I guess I could have taken notes on my phone, but that
It feels so different.
Yes. And so I ran out and I bought a notebook. And that project, Wild Women, literally, like you just said, it just spilled out on the pages of that notebook.
Yeah, I mean, it's so striking to me that, we're talking about writing and flow and listening. And uh, I feel like one of the misconceptions about writing is that people that write and write well are inherently like some kind of, there's some genius there. But often what I found in talking to writers is there's just like a real, sometimes writers, they can't help themselves, they can't stop listening, and so all of these things kind of percolate, and then they kind of brew together, and then it achieves some kind of energy, and that's when it all comes spilling out. And I think kind of talking about things in that way can sometimes make people a little bit uncomfortable because it seems to touch on like the spiritual. And for many, there's no real delineation between the spiritual and the religious.
Mhm.
And I think, yeah, that's just kind of a very uncomfortable space for some people. But if you're involved in the arts, certainly, then this is a space that people become deeply familiar with. And so kind of in that vein, in our conversations, we've touched on spirituality. And one of the things that you first said to me, that I recall you saying to me, as we were setting up this show today, was, it takes a certain spirituality to be involved in this work. And I remember my initial reaction was, oh, well, I'm not a religious person. And then, going back to what I actually heard is like, wait, that's not what Julia said, So, but why did I have that reaction? And so I wonder, like, if you can talk about that a bit, like, what is the role of spirituality in this kind of work? And in particular, how do you kind of see Black spirituality as playing into kind of a way of advancing justice?
Mhm. So I think, the first time somebody told me that my work is very spiritual, I was like, really? Where you see that? Where you see that? I was like, what are you drinking when you read what I write? you know, um, I didn't always see that. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. I think, and I think this with Black spirituality, and when you read Audre Lorde, for example, and the way that she uses spirituality as something that is part of the erotic. And for me, the erotic is the truth, right? It's an opportunity
Hmm.
to live deeply in your truth. And so spirituality is part of that truth. And I think that spirituality is always all around us.
Mm.
And we can tap into it in different ways, but we're trained away from it, which is what Audre Lorde talks about when she talks about the uses of the erotic, right? And that the capitalism, et cetera, all these different structures takes us away from these things that are freely available to us, that we can use to ground ourselves, that we can use to understand the work that we do. So spirituality has become important for me in terms of thinking about the work that I do and why I do what I do. So one of the first things that I always stop and ask myself before I say yes to a project or anything is why?
Mm.
is this aligned with what I think I was sent here to do, what the ancestors want me to do? So you hear me talk a lot about the ancestors and them guiding my work. And that to me is a spiritual practice, right? So to listen to the lineage from which you came and ground your work in in them. And I think for Black women, and a lot of Black women are, relatively speaking, are moving away from former religions, or what we think about as former religion, right? Which tends to be tied to Western understandings of religion, and are going back to what is sometimes commonly referred to as indigenous religious practices and spiritual practices. So I just recently went to the beach, telling on myself because I needed a little break. And I sat on the beach and there was nobody around me and it was just the water. And it was the most spiritual experience, right? Because on the one hand, I recognized as a Black woman that the water took me away from what I knew,
Mm.
right? In terms of slavery. But the water can also give me what I need. And I've experienced that in terms of understanding some of the pain that I experienced as a result of race gender violence. I was able to understand it sitting at the shore, recognizing that the pain that I was experiencing wasn't just my pain, but it was a pain of these women that had gone before me, right? And when I moved to Rhode Island, something I wasn't aware of was the relationship between Rhode Island and Barbados in terms of slavery,
Oh, yeah.
right? And for some reason, I didn't know that. And I couldn't understand, why is this place, this physical place, so painful for me? Like, I mean, really painful. And why was I having these experiences with race gender violence in a way that I had never experienced before? And it was literally sitting at the edge of the water that it came to me. And, this is probably going to sound a little weird to folk that don't understand quite how spirituality works. But this woman came to me, and I could see me in her, and I could see her in me. And she also let me know that we were going to be okay,
Wow.
that I could continue to resist race gender violence, that it wasn't going to be the end of me. Because I got to the point where I was like, well, I can't continue this. I can't continue this. I physically couldn't continue it. Emotionally, I couldn't continue this fight. But she just let me know, and there were like three women that I encountered in Rhode Island, and in their own ways, they let me know that the fight was beyond me for justice, for one, right? And that I would be okay.
Wow.
And I think that for me, on a very personal level, is how spirituality plays into my life.
I mean, thank you for that. One thing that I do want to maybe dig into a little bit, just a few moments ago, you mentioned something along the lines of, for those who don't quite understand how spirituality works. And I wonder if you could kind of give us kind of a nutshell or like a really quick thing from your perspective so that people can understand what it is that you mean when you say that.
I don't know that I have an easy answer, because I think spirituality is something that's individually experienced, unlike religion. We can experience religion as a collective, which is why we go to church. But spirituality is something, I think, and when I say it at an individual level, I don't mean individualism.
Mm.
It's practiced by capitalists, but I mean it's something where we all have the ability to access it. So yesterday, I'll give this as an example. And again, I might not be able to define it, but I'll give this as an example. So I have a student who's getting ready to graduate, and she had this moment where she paused because she's lost people along her life, and she goes, "They're not here to celebrate with me." And we're talking like you and I are talking. We're not in person. And the spirit came to me and said, and I said to her, "They're here in the wind." I was like, I can't explain it to you, That's just what was given to me to give to you.
Mm.
That people are in the wind. And every time you are part of the wind, you are part in part with your people. So rest assured that they're here.
I
And
feel that.
that's how spirituality works, right?
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about being at the beach and just hearing the water and everything, again, that really resonates for me. So I don't think I've said this to you before, but the ocean is something that I feel deeply, deeply connected to. It has a lot of the rhythms that I think we experience in life.
Mhm.
And I don't think that we can ignore the fact that sometimes that the sound of waves breaking, it's eerily similar to the sound of a crowd of people, maybe far, far away. And it is, in some sense, despite the fact that we as humans have distributed ourselves all over the world, it is the ocean that connects all of us in some way, shape, or form.
Mhm. Yep. There's a reason that water makes up what, three-quarters of the world and three-quarters of our bodies?
Hmm. Hmm.
Saying, so I really think that again, spirituality is something that is experienced at an individual level. It's experience in that place that's deep inside of you, where nobody can really access but you,
Mm.
if that makes sense.
It does.
Um, and so the question becomes, can we sit still enough to hear it and to
Mm.
trust it? And I really do believe that we were sent here, all of us were sent here with what we need. It is just that structures are in place to remove us from that.
I mean, and that seems to relate to what you were saying earlier about truth and the erotic, another term that I think makes a lot of Americans in particular very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Um, and especially in relation to things like work. But it does strike me that we have this very false conception that there's our work self and then there's our other selves. But, the truth is you don't have a separate work self. You're still the same person. You still are affected by the same truth, the same, experience of the erotic, if you will. And by not willingly seeing that or integrating those parts of ourselves, we are really depriving ourselves in many ways. So I don't know if you have some insight on that, but I know that there are a lot of people that suffer because they see work as a completely different experience. And we know that, say discussions of spirituality and certainly anything that smacks of the erotic might prompt a call to HR or something. And
Mhm.
there are real social sanctions against accessing these things in the workplace. And I think that we're probably worse off because of that.
Right. I think that what happens is that people reduce the erotic to sex, right?
Yeah.
And but that's not, the erotic is way more than that. And then sometimes even how it gets reduced to sex in a capitalist structure, it can lose a lot of what the erotic can mean and give to us. So, a very simple way of thinking about the erotic would be to think about pleasure, right? And not just sexual pleasure, but where are you finding pleasure in doing all parts of your life? Now, that doesn't mean everything you do is going to be joy filled and, not mundane or whatever. But when you operate from a place of pleasure, your work really does change.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? It really does change. That doesn't, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that every day is a delight, like a little kid going to a candy store. But it does give your work a different texture. And I think it gives it a different texture because it allows us to not operate from this place where we're disembodied.
Mm.
Because capitalism does cause us to divorce ourselves from ourselves. And so, this conversation with some women, And one of the women was, thinking about what she's going to do on this long trip she has to take. And she's structuring and planning and stuff like that, and going back and forth. And finally I said, well, what if you just let your heart tell you what you need to do? And she was like, my heart? Like, yeah, your heart. It has knowledge. And this is how we become disembodied from ourselves, from our truth, from our erotic, right? Is that we Western society tells us to privilege our mind.
Yeah.
And that's the only place rational thought comes from, because we associate the heart with irrational thinking and stuff like that, right?
And if we're being really honest, Western society often frames matters of the heart, as being related to women, and therefore not as intelligent, not as valuable, not as.
Right. And so I said to her, I said, here's something to think about. Let your heart bring you to a place of your childhood where you experience pure joy.
Mm.
Just a thought, right? And ask yourself, like, what was so joyful about that? And then give yourself an opportunity. Of course, you can't go back in time. But when I think, and again, I don't, have data about this as a social scientist, but I think, those moments where of our childhood that brought us pure joy, it was probably because we were living from our hearts.
Yeah. And that speaks very clearly to me of freedom as well, which we were talking about earlier.
Yes, right. And so, the other woman on the call was like, "Oh, but then you need to think," and one's a lawyer and one's a medical doctor, right? So it's
Oh,
fascinating,
okay.
right? It's just so, and then there's like, kind of sort of Julia that, is a social scientist, but like, oh well, let's talk about, let's talk about the spirits talking to us. And so the medical doctor then talks about, oh, but then you have to think about, why did I have that memory versus the other memory, and what does it mean when you have? I'm like, no, please don't do that.
Oh, geez.
Just let, just let the memory be. Just let the memory be.
It's so interesting that we're talking about this in this way, because one of the things that Team All Aces has been really kind of reflecting on is we go into organizations who contact us because they like to do organizational change. They would like to advance racial equity. In the course of doing that, but then we often encounter resistance, like, oh, this is so much work, we're so busy. And it's the very opposite of this freedom, this joy, this place of love that you're talking about. And well, what we know is if we're trying to advance racial equity, racial justice, and it's not coming from a place of love, from a place of joy, then like, why would we do it? Then it makes no sense. It becomes this very adversarial thing that people can, sometimes kind of cast as, oh, you're just advancing a political agenda, you just want power, when in fact that's really not where it comes from.
No.
So I guess my question for you is like, how can we help ourselves to connect back to truth, back to the erotic, back to love and freedom and all those things that you and I and other social scientists also know will ultimately liberate us from these very much self-imposed restrictions that are harming so many of us in so many ways on an ongoing basis?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I'm hesitating because I want to make a distinction when we talk about care. I think sometimes we reduce care to a capitalist practice, right?
Mm.
And to an Instagram post. So I don't want to
Very
talk
performative.
right. I don't want to talk about that care. And I think, to come back to Audre Lorde, people tend to conflate, I think, her understanding of self-care and conflate it with repair care. I don't think Audre Lorde was talking about repair care. Repair care is, you have to repair yourself from these structures that cause us harm, that cause disembodiment, that cause us to move away from the erotic, etc. That's kind of repair care. Once you get to the point where you're repaired as best you can, and I think that repair care is something that's ongoing, then you can get to self-care. And self-care is self-care, not and people also kind of, I think, misunderstand this. If you read a lot of Audre Lorde's work, when she talks about self-care, she's doing it in community, right? So she
Yeah.
recognizes that when an individual is well, they are then able to go out in the community and interact with people, not from an extractive standpoint, right? Which is, I think, how people view um, diversity work, et cetera, right? It's still grounded in this very extractive,
Oh, yeah. In advancing the bottom line for employers and organizations, right?
right? As opposed to seeing it as we get to be in a healthier community.
Right. We get to feel better, and not just feel better, but actually have opportunities to be better.
To do better, right?
Yeah.
To do better for each other, which
Hmm.
brings me back to kind of where we started this conversation around, my mother and community mental health, right? And that's
Yeah.
sort of how I see some of the work that we're doing and why it has to be justice work done in community. But we first have to care for ourselves, politically and physically and spiritually. We have to care for our sensual selves, right? So that very kind of human ability to engage the sensual, I think, is also needed. And then we get to go out in community and not be extractive,
Hmm. Yeah.
but be constructive, imagining a community where people's needs are met, and not because you want something in return. Now that sounds very utopian, right? In a capitalist structure. And we were having this conversation before we started, and when we were talking about scarcity and the notion of scarcity, and
Yeah.
we talked about scarcity around food isn't a real thing. It's
Yeah.
a man-made
Completely.
thing.
Yeah.
Completely man-made.
In talking about scarcity, right? We know that capitalism famously does this in a number of, well, in many, many scenarios, like ones that come to mind: food scarcity, of course, housing scarcity, the diamond market, for example, like completely unnecessary. We can create all of those in labs for far cheaper. Nobody has to die. We don't have to, fuel conflicts, state conflicts with these kinds of things. Um, but in nature, when we have this kind of very extractive element, either something happens to eliminate it or it causes a system to collapse, right? In the human body, when that's what cancer is, right? It extracts blood flow to use up resources to propagate itself, and it ends up killing the host organism. And so it's just so strange to me that so many of us have pinned our success, our dreams, our hopes, our entire lives to subscribing to this kind of model. And I don't know if I necessarily have a question here, but I'm just kind of wondering if, in some of the things you've learned, some of the things that flow through you, you've got any insights into some things that we can be doing right now that can help us to kind of move the ball forward.
Right. Well, speaking from personal experience and trying to heal from what was referred to and is referred to as like racial trauma, and I say race gender trauma because I'm simultaneously raised and gendered. I'm not one or the other. Um, is for me involves coming back to self, right? And this is what I think Audre Lorde is talking about when she says self-care, is coming back to self,
Mm,
coming back to these. this understanding of self that we all kind of entered in, because like you rightly said, we live kind of like disembodied because society can make us that way. And so we're always kind of fractured. And I sometimes use this as an example when I'm trying to explain to people what it means to come back to self. And to come back to self is to harness your own power, right?
Mm.
So my mother is really, really good at patching garden hoses,
Okay.
right? A skill set, I don't know, anyhow. So she's good at patching garden hoses. And I always kind of laugh. But here's where I use it as an example. When a garden hose needs patching, you never get the full force of the water
Mm-hmm.
because it's coming out in all places, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It'll still come out where it's supposed to. So there's still always a piece of us that will exist and come out at the top of the hose. But meanwhile, there are all these pieces of us that are being siphoned off
Yeah.
and probably going places where you don't need them to go.
Mm-hmm.
So your energy is diluted. And so what we need are people like my mother who know how to patch a garden hose and could patch us so that the force of our water, right, our power to speak, to act, to do, to be, comes out where it needs to come out with the force that it needs to come out with,
Yeah.
right? And especially when I talk to women, I use that analogy. I'm like, does your garden hose need patching?
I love it. And you know what? That analogy really works very well for what you were saying about writing as well, like being a conduit and and integrity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I certainly know in the course of writing that's one of the hardest things to do is to maintain focus and to not kind of fly off into a million directions. So we've got
Fly off into a million directions, you find your way back. And sometimes flying off into a million directions might give you something you didn't anticipate. That's exactly what you need.
That's absolutely true too. So Jeff Pugh has a question, and for transparency's sake, Jeff is actually the person that connected both you and I. So thank you, Jeff. And Jeff's question is, I wonder how we can strengthen this connection across ties of allyship where common spirit is the unifying force rather than identity and experience.
Oh, interesting question, Mr. Jeff. I don't know that. And I should say, of course, I know Jeff,
Yeah.
so I can kind of tease. I don't know, Jeff, honestly. And my initial thought was, why does it need to be either or?
Hmm.
I don't know. I need to think about that. And why my initial response is to wonder if it needs to be either or. Why can't it be a common spirit? I need to think about that.
Fair enough. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that either.
Yeah,
But
I need to think about that. So I'm going to write that down and I'm going to give that some thought.
I mean, while we're kind of thinking about it, I'd like to return to something you said earlier, which was you said something like you no longer say that you engage in research, but you tell stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that an important part of your work is is that of counter narrative, particularly around how power is implemented. So I wonder if you can if you can talk about that a bit.
I always say, look, the simple answer is, I'm a Black woman. What you want me to do? You tell stories. And not only am I a Black woman from the Caribbean. So seriously, I grew up with stories. I grew up with stories because we are oral people, right? And there's something really beautiful in stories. But I think why I say I tell stories is that research seems to pretend that there's a beginning and an end. A story doesn't necessarily have to end. And I think about the way my grandmother tells stories. um, they evolve. That doesn't mean they're not true, but she shares bits and pieces. And in the book Wild Women, I actually use my grandmother as the foundation for theorizing. And I talk about Black women's testifying, the practice of testifying, right? And that each story can have multiple branches that can evolve over time. And so if I tell a story, one particular part of a story, it doesn't stop me from also adding to that story. But the other reason I say I tell stories is that that actually came to me one day. And I was sitting trying to write out a vision for myself as an academic. Like, so why am I in this space and what am I trying to do? And how is it that I claim that I am against a certain type of power structure, but here I am contributing to this power structure. I'm like, girl, that's some hot mess. So how do you reconcile all of that?
Yeah.
And so I tend to sit quiet and let things come. That's my practice. And as I'm thinking about trying to articulate this vision for myself in the academy, I actually saw this older woman, older Black woman. I'm not going to go into all the details about who and what she was. And I also saw Ida B. Wells Barnett, who told stories around lynching. I'm like, I ain't know Ida B. Wells Barnett. I don't fool myself thinking, for me, she's up here, Um, and it dawned on me that part of my ministry of teaching is to tell stories, is to give people knowledge in the form of stories, right? So the kind of the same way my grandmother told me about when she was younger and how she would walk and talk to the sugar canes. And as a little girl, I didn't always understand that.
Yeah. It seems kind of cryptic.
Right. But if you know my grandmother's life, her mother died when she was 3. She was raised by a very abusive aunt. And over the years, the story unfolded about why she would walk and talk to the sugarcane. 2 years ago, I got another piece of the story. My grandmother I don't think she'll mind me sharing her age. She'll be 93 this year.
Wow.
Right? What she would say to the sugar canes was her vision of herself. And one of the things she would say is that she wanted to be able to live long enough, if she had children, to see her children grow. And if they had children, to see her grandchildren grow. Well, I'm the grandchild. Now she has a great-grand. Now she has a great-great-grand.
Wow.
And so on March 12th, why this kind of resonates with me a little bit about this notion of stories is that on March 12th this year, 5 generations of Harper women sat together via computer, ranging from almost 93 to 9 months old.
Wow, that's crazy.
That's my grandmother's story.
Yeah.
Now, it seems on the surface of like, some little old woman making stuff up or whatever. But I think when you dig deeper in that, right, there is a kind of, and we were talking about the erotic, my grandmother recognizing her erotic and speaking it, her truth, right? Speaking it, right? And so for me, telling stories is actually a politic and a practice of speaking it, right? In a way that allows me to bring in, you talked about the rhythm of the ocean, but for me to bring in the rhythm of Black women, right?
Yeah.
Imagining my grandmother as a 10-year-old little girl walking and talking to a sugarcane,
I can see it.
right? That's what I want to do.
And one thing that I've observed is a lot of people don't understand that so much of what we treat as reality is in fact a story.
Mhm.
The story of colonialism, a
Mhm.
story of conquest, a
Mhm.
story of domination.
Yes. Mhm.
And they're not understanding that while they might not be the main characters, they're certainly part of that background crowd that makes that all real.
Mhm. Which is why, you mentioned colonialism, et cetera, which is why this little 10-year-old little girl is walking, talking to the sugar canes.
Yeah, because sugarcane does not come from Barbados
It's not
either.
Barbados either. And it's in part colonialism, the institutions of colonialism that contributed in part to the reality that she faced as a 10-year-old.
Yeah, yeah. Like for Americans that are obsessed with work, we often feel stuck in the workplace because we have the same stories being told of domination, of progress, of profit.
Mhm.
And we don't always see ourselves in that story because often the story that we're being told is you are here to advance the bottom line for someone else. Like,
Mhm.
well, what does that have to do with me?
Right.
And so I think part of the challenge of advancing racial equity is helping people to understand that they are part of that story and that they're not just part of that story, they can be telling that story too. And it
Yes.
doesn't have to look this way.
And it
Yeah.
doesn't have to look a particular way, which is why my grandmother's story is so important to me because she imagined a different life. Her mother died in her 20s
Wow.
when she was 3. She didn't even know a mother,
Yeah.
you know. Um, and one of the best kind of compliments I ever got of like the stuff that I've written is just one day I opened up my email. I had a random email from this young woman, and she said to me about Black women, cultural images, and social policy. She said, "Thank you." She goes, "You gave me a language that allowed me to see myself, to understand my experience where I didn't have a language before, right?" And if nobody else ever read that book, I was satisfied. Satisfied if she was the only person who ever read it, you know? And I recently tweeted that, that book was published in 2008 and I still get these little small royalty checks, like, well, maybe I'll buy a large fry with it. um, but that book, the editor had said that nobody was going to buy it. That, people question me, why would you want to write about Black women? Is there enough stuff to write about Black women? I was actually told by a colleague, yeah, I was told by a colleague not to research and write on Black women that my career wouldn't advance,
That's ridiculous.
right? And these people probably thought they meant well,
I don't know. That just doesn't seem like I can't imagine myself saying that in a constructive way.
but, like I said, I come from a long line of Harper women and I come from a line of women that I haven't met that clearly are stubborn because we're still here, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, that book, their stories in and of itself about just about everything that I've published and the resistance to publishing around Black women, right? And I still find myself committed to wanting to tell the stories of Black women because I know that somebody is going to see themselves in that story and they're going to know that their experience is valid. And that's one of the responses that we get from Black Girl Magic, beyond the hashtag, is that people actually, will say to me that they have a language of understanding certain things that
Hmm.
they felt and couldn't always necessarily articulate. And that's why I write, and it kind of seems like maybe it's coming from a place of ego, but it really isn't. It's I'm really trying to help Black women see themselves and not see ourselves as broken in need of fixing or any of that neo-colonial, neo-capitalist stuff, right? but to see ourselves so that we can repair and then we can engage in self-care so that we can come in out into community and fight for justice.
So I'm so glad that you brought up Black Girl Magic because the other day, my colleague Janifa Fortune made a comment in a meeting that we were in, and she said that our team had really helped her to see her own, to access her own Black Girl Magic. And I wasn't 100% sure about what that meant. So for those of us who are less familiar with the phrase Black Girl Magic, can you just kind of give us a quick overview of what that means?
Right. So I believe it was in 2015, Sean Thomas tweeted a version of Black Girl Magic, and it became this very popular phrase from Black, the Black Twitterverse, and the whole nine, and it took on a life of its own. And so in Black Girl Magic, beyond the hashtag, we delve into this conversation of what does it mean? What does Black Girl Magic mean? And it's possible to trace the notion of Black Girl Magic to people like Alice Walker, etc., where Black women have been talking for a very long time about how we make ourselves real when we're not supposed to be real.
Mhm.
And so part of the book, we talk about how Black women actually take bits and pieces and bring them back together to create a whole, and sometimes a whole that nobody would ever imagine, right? And so at the foundation of Black Girl Magic is work. It's not hocus pocus. It's not, sitting down dreaming and then things are going to manifest. It's actually doing the work to, again, repair, and then engage in self-care, to live that truth, right? And we talk a lot about self-articulation, which is a story of my grandmother talking to
Yeah.
the Keys is about self-articulation. um, where Black girls aren't always given space for self-articulation because we are constructed in a particular way that does not always allow ourselves to see ourselves deeply and fully, but to see us as disembodied. And so Black Girl Magic gives us an opportunity to challenge that and push back against it.
Well, thank you for that. That does certainly open things up for me. And I think, it kind of just reinforces everything that we've been talking about. And it does give me a certain amount of hope because I think, again, if we are too scared or we are told that there is no use in telling certain stories, then that dominant narrative, that dominant story is going to exist.
Mhm,
And frankly, not to humanize it exactly, but that's what the dominant narrative wants.
mhm, mhm.
So, you know,
Yeah.
it's going to take all of us telling all of our stories if we're going to not only find our way in the world, I think, but create places for ourselves and for each other, which is, at the heart of what Dr. Atia Martin, our CEO and founder, refers to as collective care.
Yeah.
And, certainly in speaking to you today, I feel like we've been engaging in it. So thank you so very much for your time here today. I really appreciate it. And before we kind of close out, I'd like to ask you, one, about your upcoming documentary, but also about, in 30 seconds or less, a very impossible task, I think, but in 30 seconds or less, what would you love to see come out of your work?
Um, what I would love to see come out of my work is that it helps Black women to heal, which is what the documentary is about. How Black women use herbs and what we call bush medicine in Barbados as a way of healing not just the individual, but also cultures.
Wow.
So that's what I would like to come out of my work, my time here on Earth.
Great. Do you want to set up this clip that we're going to play just after this?
Right. So it's a trailer for the documentary called Healing Roots, which is about Black Barbadian women's use of herbs and medicinal for medicinal purposes. Um, and it really looks at how women, Black Barbadian women, are holders of culture, Afrocentric culture in particular. So that's what that's about.
Great. Thank you. And so thank you so much once again, Julia. It was a real pleasure talking to you and getting to know you in the time leading up to this. This is your host, once again, Enrico E. Manalo with Intentionally Act Live. Miles, if you could, please.
They could enslave their bodies, but they could not take away their linguistic and cultural consciousness.
So she taught me her knowledge that was passed on from her grandfather to her.
You're dealing with healing, right? You're dealing with a homegrown remedy. Looking at bush medicine.
Unfortunately, I think that a lot of this knowledge is being lost.
It was like a bell ringing for me. Something has to be done to stop this leakage.
Bush, who call him bush?